Hello, we are studying Chapter 8 right now, which is dealing with school finance, and I'm just going to give you a few highlights from this chapter. So the first thing I want you to keep in mind is that each state has control of their education system, including their financial budgets. So each state is going to be a little bit different, but this kind of gives you an overview of where the three major sources of revenue come to all school districts across the United States. So the three main sources are local, state, and federal. The largest amounts of money for each district usually come from within the local or state level. Okay, so local would come from property taxes. And if you pay property taxes, you can look right there on your taxes and it'll say in Garden City how much of your taxes, how many dollars from your taxes went to USD 457. So the majority of local taxes come from property taxes. State taxes is the second source of revenue. The majority, especially in Kansas, of the taxes for this comes from sales tax. And then you have the federal, and this only amounts to about 10% of a school's finances or their budget. So just the key thing I want you to keep in mind is that the majority of money to school districts come from either the local or the state level. Another term that you might hear about is I ran a report for the state of Kansas on expenditures per pupil for every district in the state. And I highlighted a few on here for you that I thought you might be interested in. As you can see, Garden City, Dodge City, and Scott City are all fairly close as far as the amounts of money that they spent per pupil. Now, the biggest discrepancies I also found, the highest was Rolla at $24,035, and Elkhart, which was only $8,675. So that's a huge difference in the amount of money that is being spent for their education system. And so that's where there's a lot of debate within our state, as well as most other states out there, is how do we keep it equitable between each district? So we talked about earlier that income for a district or revenue for a school district comes from both local and state. That's where the majority of the money comes from. So if a district has a high revenue coming from property taxes, they're going to have a lot more money. And so the idea is, theoretically, the idea is that we would want to let it balance out so that those districts that get a lot of money from local funding maybe don't get as much from the state. And then vice versa. Districts that don't get very much locally should get more from the state in order to equal the funding out a little bit. Now, another thing that we have to keep in mind is, it seems deceiving, but some of our smaller districts actually take more money per pupil to run the district because they still have to have a principal, they still have to have a superintendent, they have to have the teachers. They just maybe don't have as many students per teacher. They have some other expenses oftentimes because they have fewer students per square mile, and so busing tends to take up a large part of their budget as far as getting students to school. That some of those smaller districts are really spread out, and those students have to travel longer distances to get to school. They're more rural. So I just thought I'd throw this in there, something you might be interested in. Expenditures per pupil. And this is basically the amount of money that it takes a district to run per student. So how much money the district spends for everything. This would include everything from bus drivers and custodians to teachers, administrators, superintendents. It would also include books and supplies, computers, everything from desks and chairs as well. So basically, expenditure per pupil is how much money does the district spend for everything to run the entire school district. There were two key court cases when we talk about school finance. The first one is Serrano versus Priest, which was a California case. Basically, this is what we were just talking about. California ruled that the state needs to establish some type of budget system that equals out the amount of money per school district so that it's more equal. So just kind of the original case that established those things that we were just talking about on the previous slide. The other one was San Antonio versus Rodriguez, which was a 1973 U.S. Supreme Court case. Biggest thing I want you to know about this one is that it just upheld the ruling that from the 10th Amendment that education and finances of education will be up to each individual state. We talked about the fact that the smallest percentage of money for school districts comes from the federal government. But when it does, it usually comes in one of two types of grants or funding, categorical or block. And I want you to make sure that you know the difference between these two. A categorical grant are funds that are targeted for a specific group of students or for a specific purpose, and they couldn't be used for anything else. A block grant, on the other hand, is money that's given to a district or given to a school, and then they can choose to use it in the best ways that they feel is appropriate. This is kind of what type of grant are schools getting. This is one of those things in education. They talk about a pendulum that goes back and forth, and that's kind of what we've seen with the types of federal aid that comes into school districts. So I'll just give you an example. When my first year of teaching, I was teaching in a school district, a smaller school district, that had a categorical grant for their Title I funds. Now, Title I funds were for students that were from low-income families. And so since it was a categorical grant, we had a Title I tutor that came in and helped students that were maybe struggling, having a little bit of difficulty. They could get pulled out of class time in order to get some one-on-one tutoring. Well, I had a particular student that was really struggling. She needed a lot of help. And so I tried to get her in with this Title I tutor that we had in our school. I was not able to do that because this girl did not come from a low-income family. And so she was not able to use that tutor. Only students that were coming from low incomes could access that tutor. And so that was a little bit frustrating. So in some ways, as a teacher, I thought, gosh, I wish this were a block grant when I could just use it for any student that needed it. Like I said, this is a pendulum. It has it swung back the other way in the late 90s, where it was more of a block grant, and any student could have accessed that tutor if they needed it or if the teacher felt like that it was necessary. It's kind of swung back the other way a little bit in recent times. I believe right now the way the Title I grants work is that if your school district has 10% or less, it's basically considered like a categorical grant that only students from the low-income families could access it or access the services that are being provided through those funds. But if your school district has more than 40% of low income, which in Garden City, almost every school, I believe, last I knew, every school in Garden City was at that level. So in that case, it would be considered more of a block grant, and any student that needed the services could access it, no matter what their family income was. So just wanted to give you a little background there, knowing the difference between categorical and a block grant. One idea was school finance, reforming school finance, and how do we make our schools better? How do we give every student the opportunity to the best education they can get, is the idea of school choice and giving students that opportunity to attend either a public school, a regular public school, or a charter school or a magnet school. Now, all of those are considered public schools because they're funded through public money, okay? Or there's a private school choice. And so you guys have an assignment this week, researching a little bit. That our chapter talks a little bit about charter schools and introduces that idea to you. You have an assignment on researching this a little bit to find out a little bit more about school choice. The voucher system is the idea that each student is allotted so much money, and then they could choose to use that money to attend whatever school they wanted to. So if I wanted to send my student to private school, I could do that, and the amount of money from the state would go towards their tuition that I would otherwise have to be paying. So hopefully through your research and as you continue with this, you'll learn just a little bit more about this as we go.